A brief intro of today's speaker, Dr. Srivathsan. Dr. A. Srivathsan is an architectural scholar with more than 30 years of cumulative experience in teaching, architectural and developmental research, and professional practice. Some of his major research projects include re-envisioning the city, research funded under Indo-Dutch program on alternatives in development, Mega Cities project. Humpy, the Indian Digital Heritage Research Project, as part of a larger team, a Department of Science and Technology initiative. His publications include books and papers in reputed journals. Before joining his role as the Executive Director of Center for Research on Architecture and Urbanism, CAU, Dr. Srivathsan served as the Academic Director of CEPT University for 5 years, where he worked closely with deans and the heads of academic offices to refine academic policies and practices, to strengthen academic rigor and deepen the culture of research at CEPT University. Prior to that, he has been associated with The Hindu as Senior Deputy Editor while serving as adjunct faculty at Asian College of Journalism and at the School of Architecture and Planning, Anna University, both in Chennai. Prior to this, he was assistant professor at Anna University, Chennai for 10 years. He has also been a practicing architect for 8 years. He is an active member of various institutional bodies, contributing to the development of new academic programs and introducing new courses. Dr. Srivathsan holds a PhD from Indian Institute of Technology, along with a master's degree in urban design from School of Planning and Architecture, New Delhi. In present-day context, there are few who write about architecture in newspapers like The Hindu and dailies which reach the masses. And Dr. Srivathsan is among those rare people who do that regularly. And this is something I see missing in architecture nowadays, which we connect with the people. So he is the right person to bring the architecture to the masses. Ladies and gentlemen, with these few words, I call Dr. Srivathsan to deliver his talk on topic, how does architecture writing matter? Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, IAA Chennai, friends Anthony, Kurian, Prashant, and Muzakir for inviting me today. And congratulations for what looks like a wonderful magazine there. Congratulations also due to Mr. Raju and Mr. Zacharias. I'm meeting them after they won the elections and took the leadership of IAA. Congratulations, sirs, and best wishes to you and your team. I look forward to some wonderful initiatives from you. So today I'm going to settle for breadth than depth. So imagine myself as a landscape painter. I'm going to lay out the landscape of architectural writing and what it entails and why it matters. Or to borrow a scientific metaphor, I'm settling for a telescope than a microscope. So in the next 25-30 minutes or so, let me lay out some of the points that matter to writing, particularly architectural writing. So let me share my screen and start my presentation. Okay, I hope you're able to share see my screen.
We are not yet able to.
Not yet.
Not yet?
Not yet.
Just a second. I don't.
Yeah.
Now?
It's just starting.
Yes.
Yes. Now it's. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Perfect.
So the title of today is how does architectural writing matter? Just as any question, all questions have nested questions. So before we tend to answer a question, we try to sort of disaggregate and see what other questions it contains. And I see in this question 3 sub-questions. The first question is, let's come to writing later. First, does architecture matter? If it really doesn't matter, there's no purpose of writing about it. It's just singing to the choir. It makes no impact. The second nested question is, yeah, we agree, suppose, architecture matters, but the question is whether writing matters. Okay, so how does it matter? The third question is, yes, let's say we cross the two questions, we take a yes for an answer, both matters, but how do we make it count? Yeah, how do we make it count by writing? Just mere writing doesn't solve the problem. Okay. So let me address these three questions over the next 25 odd minutes. And I'm not really going to dwell on the first question for this audience, except flag a few issues, because to talk to the peers about whether architecture matters is an entirely a different way of discussing it. And today, I'm more interested in focusing on question number 2 and 3. But nevertheless, let me flag the first question. There have been a lot of people who have been writing, and mostly architects, understandably so, that architecture matters. And some anthropologists too, culture theorists too, have written, and what is the relationship between architecture and society and why it's important. But there are also disagreements within the peer community as to what kind of architecture matters, whether all architecture matters or there is a particular kind of architecture that matters. And this book, for instance, by Jeremy Till and his colleagues or friends, actually do not agree that all kinds of architecture matters. In their view, only architecture that exhibits certain kind, or not necessarily exhibit, but engender in empowering of social relationships, apart and along with formal sophistication. Architecture that works not only with their knowledge, but with all people around themselves, the community in which they work, and also sort of that is self-critical, etc. And they've gone about classifying what matters and what doesn't matter. Or there are others who have taken a different route to explain what kind of architecture matters. And in this case, Saunders absolutely a useful list of 8 values that an architecture should possess in order to be meaningful. And I don't have to go through this, we can do it another time, but simply putting a point that the beginning of this conversation is that we do meaningful architecture. And here I'm not saying only those which are usually classified as alternative to be far more meaningful than what is usually called as mainstream. In fact, I'm increasingly disagreeing with such categories. And everything is mainstream, and unless it's mainstream, its impact and its meaningfulness to the society is very limited. So, except to say that all of us are deeply committed, not only to improving our profession through such discourses and writings, but we're also meaningfully committed to contribute to the society within our best capabilities. And through that architecture, is the architecture that matters. Okay, and that's all what we are going to talk about. Okay, so I move to the second question quickly. Now, here starts the challenge. Let's say all of us agree. I'm sure this crowd for sure will agree that architecture matters, but there is a disagreement on many fronts as to that the writing doesn't matter or whether the writing matters at all. One of the first resistance comes, and this I'm going to talk about the general perception before I get to the architect's perception. The general perception is pictures can speak, buildings can say the story, and it is perceptible. You can experience it directly. So then why should you write? Why should you come between the object, the building, and the experience and the user? Okay, so, and second challenge is increasingly culture is becoming very photographic, very visual in its. So words are actually dead, says one of the issues of Fortune in 2014, and put this picture between 2005 and 2014 in St. Peter's and said how the culture has changed. As Frederick Jemison reminds us that photography has rendered verbal evocation less urgent. There's no need. We can talk about it later. We can write about it later. What is important is record, register the moment visually and probably discuss with it visually. I'm not undermining the importance of the visual, but I'm only pointing out to the surfeit of the visual over that of the verbal, which is a challenge. And it's becoming even more challenged when you want to discuss the quality of architecture in a larger cultural environment, which is more interested in terse, short, pithy communication through various means. But this is the larger cultural condition. But what we must be more worried about is the concern within the peers. As very famously Mies van der Rohe said, build, don't talk, he says. But he ended up talking as this picture shows, which is a very interesting book by Adrian Forty, which explains that though architect keeps saying drawing matters, drawing is the essence of this profession, visual is the prime language of the thing, they always end up talking. And they rely on words not only to communicate, but also extensively understand and experience architecture. So there is a false sense of dichotomy that is created between theory and practice, between writing and practice. And this is something that one has to overcome as peers, as colleagues, that the discourse and practice are together. Yes, two sides of the same coin. It's a continuum. So the question is not whether practice is more important over writing and architecture. Architecture indeed is a practice, absolutely, there is no doubt about it. So is writing. Writing is a practice also, and the purpose of writing is to change whatever the status of the architecture from what it is now to what it could become. So in that sense, the purpose of writing is also as a similar approach and orientation to practice. So this false dichotomy is another challenge when it comes to writing, because most of them think that theory is a shadow and while building is the substance. Now, the other challenge that you normally face in a conversation is architecture cannot be written about. It's an ineffable thing made very popular by Corbusier, as like many things he pompously claims that he thinks that he has invented ineffableness, that most of the architectural experience cannot be communicated. Architecture must be experienced. It cannot be drawn fully. Certainly, it cannot be written. This ineffableness is also something that impedes any enthusiasm to write, because most of them think that the essence of architecture lies in its experience. And if it lies in its experience, communicating that experience is absolutely impossible or very close to impossible. But the answer to it comes from philosophy. If everything is ineffable, the purpose of language itself is under question, because all of us must be actually using telepathy. Okay. So language is needed because it's not a substitute for telepathy. We need to inform, and there is no social life without talking or writing or signing. And I'm borrowing all these ideas from two important Indian philosophers, Bimal Krishna Matilal and Anindam Chakrabarti. And they've extensively written about the relationship between word and the world, as seen through some of the important Indian texts dating back to centuries. Okay, so this has been the counterpoint to those who think that an architecture, or for that matter, any object, can only be perceived and inferred. Okay. But what philosophy and Indian philosophers and Indian texts traditionally, particularly the Buddhist and the Nyaya philosophy, have repeatedly shown, and that is something that we also endorse, is the means of knowing is not only with perception and inference. The means of knowing has been by words. Because without the means of knowing through words, and knowledge by testimony, which is basically, yes, what I write is subjective. What I write happens in myself, but it is my views about what I look is my testimony about that object, that building. And knowledge by testimony is a very valid means of communicating and acquiring knowledge. So this notion that architecture is only valid through experience and perception and is not accessible through words is an impediment. It comes out of a partial understanding, if not total ignorance. Another kind of resistance that we have towards writing, particularly writing critically, is that writing in theory matters in the West and doesn't matter in India. Okay. Now, again, this is a misconception. Yes, indeed, the architecture profession, as Mr. Raju said, is about 100 years old, or even if you take 1929 as the formal formation of Indian Institute of Architects, it's even less than 100 years old. But nevertheless, there is a long tradition in this country of writing, and particularly in architecture. And this is absolutely an important moment to recall. And with both Mr. Raju and Zacharias here, I would take you through that. But before, I just want to make a point that sometimes it's very important for us not to put East versus West, tradition or modern. No, that's not the binary that I'm looking at. But this is just a memory recall of the great tradition of writing about an original object, which is either it could be a text, it could be art, it could be architecture. There's a great tradition of expounding a given object. And one should not forget that we inherit such a rich heritage and culture. Just next few slides, I'll take you quickly, just for youngsters here, just to refresh your memory and point out the contribution of JAA in developing the architectural discourse in this country. 1934 April is the first edition of JAA with McKnight and Kapadia. This was just 5 years after IAA was formally formed. And from 1934 to almost 1984, the first 50 years of IAA is a remarkable publication. It's a gold mine of knowledge, information, data, drawings to understand how architecture in India developed. We have not looked at it carefully. That is another point that probably I'll take it up with Mr. Raju and Zacharias later. But yeah, please look at the 1960 editorial of the JAA. JAA is not a booklet of advertisements. It is something that will enable us to show our country what architecture means. It can even show the whole world what Indian architecture means. There's such an amount of aspiration and ambition, and also the confidence about the architecture production. And if you see the first 15 years of what has been represented in JAA, very impressive. Baladi Thompson, Benjamin and Gurudas Singh, Pollock and Chatterjee. I'm just naming a few of them. Some very remarkable architects of the 40s, 50s, and 60s. It's absolutely important. In who's who were the editors of JAA. Veena Modi and Charles Correa took over the editorship of JAA in 1961. They reformatted it. They put some very interesting articles about Architects Survey and so on and so forth. Of course, there were other magazines like the Indian Builder, Design, which has an impressive editorial board by Marcel Brewer, Rahman, Kinminde, etc. And they're great source. They kept the discourse going. They shared the information. They let the peers know what is the state of the profession. Not to mention of MAG in 1946 was essentially formed to engage with architecture, but today it has been reduced to that of an art history magazine, but that's a different matter. Okay, it's as an young undergraduate student, I grew up reading Architecture Plus Design. Started in 1984. And up and until then, JAA was the sole source of information about architecture. And it is also, we see the decline of JAA from 1984. A plus D fills in that void with a very impressive editorial board. And between 1884 to 1993, they do a phenomenal job. And this page is not clear for you to read, but there is a insightful letter to the editor from Gautam Bhatia in 84 to warn what an architectural writing should not do and what architecture design plus not do. Is very insightfully tells that don't make it look like an art magazine. Don't make it look like a travelogue. Please come up with innovative layouts, make meaningful content. I'm just summarizing his thing, and I'm sure if you have the back issues, you could read it. And exactly the architecture plus design did what he asked not to do. So post 1993, the quality of the magazine drops because it is no more the voice of the profession. When the writing is no more the voice of the publication, it loses its core constituency, which are the professionals. If a magazine loses its credibility by the kind of content it produces, it loses it. And it has a huge financial implication because your first buyers and the major subscribers are your peers, your colleagues. So if you have to minimum sell 500 copies to, let's say, 1,000 copies to break even, and that you can only do by addressing your your colleagues there. But architecture plus design exactly did that. After that, we see all kinds of initiatives coming in, particularly in the digital time. You have universities putting their private initiatives. There is even an online, there's a multiple invention. And today, accessing writing, knowledge, information, participating in discourse is far more easier than what it was before. But the question is whether they are impactful, whether they are meaningful. One of the challenges, I'm sure you know as much as I know, that producing content, a meaningful content, is increasingly difficult. Two, what is the revenue model of a print? And what is the revenue model of a digital book? And what is the break even? And coming from a university that I'm part of, we're always hesitant to start a journal because content is the biggest challenge in producing a journal. And second is the revenue model through which you would probably break even. And also setting up the entire peer mechanism. I'm very glad to hear that the JAA has moved more to the peer system. So the multiple initiatives are there, and it's far more the space of writing is democratized, a lot more can contribute, a lot more can access. But its impactfulness still needs to be evaluated. Now, that is the ground condition. But let's come to the substantive part. Equally a substantive part here, whether writing matters. Paul Goldberger, known as one of the well-known architecture critics, says so. Why? Because it tells us writing is meant to explain what are the values of the building. It's a profound conversation. It may not change architecture all that much at that all immediately, because always ask what's the point of writing. Actually, you should ask the counter question, what is the loss by not writing? The gains can be less. The losses are even more profound. Because without a discourse, first, the profession itself will not move forward. Without this discourse, you cannot enrich readers' experience. So writing becomes central to the architectural production. I'm not saying it's far more important. It is as much as important as practice and how do we build, but the discourse. But the last point is something that has been my personal interest in writing. How do you create a bigger constituency for design? If we don't tell the stories ourselves of how important and significant buildings are, if we don't get it endorsed by non-architects from their user experience, that design really matters. And it is through such an exchange through means of writing. It's not just by perception and inference, but through knowledge by testimony. If a client writes a testimony saying how good your design has improved her life, that's the greatest endorsement of architecture that matters. And when it is formally written and it is woven into the discourse, the constituency for better design expands. And that is one of the important points for the profession. And second, Michael Sarkin very remarkably, insightfully says that it is a service profession. Writing is a service. Why is it a service? Because it allows people, it performs the evaluative function. It whets the significance. One of the famous description between what an architect does and what a critique does. Architect always speaks about what she has accomplished, while a critic always points to what is not accomplished. Not in a cynical sense, not in a negative sense, but basically vetting. So writing, as much as describing very richly and allowing clients to appreciate, also does a performative function. So without that self-performative function, without that self-evaluation, we will not be able to go forward. Okay. And also we are always talking and expanding the outcomes of architecture. What does this project deliver, apart from it standing as a wonderful object on site as evocative and artistic experience? What are the outcomes? What does it mean for people, etc.? It's a tireless work, as Sarkin says. It's a tireless propaganda in a very good sense of it, not in a manipulative sense. So in continuous writing about the significance of architecture in terms of what it means, not only to profession, but to society, is one of the important functions. I come to the last question here, and I'll be a little quick here so that we get some time for conversation at the end. Yes, both are important. Architecture is important, writing is important. But why it doesn't count? The first problem is in matter of writing. This is a classic textbook, and I often use in my class Alexandra Lange's writing about architecture. She makes a very simple and a straightforward point. Please get to the point. Because most of the architectural writing could be absolutely verbose and entangled. Okay, so our prescription to students and anyone who's aspiring to write is says, please tell us what is at stake. And that's the purpose of writing. And this is another classic book, I again use it to teach, gives you a very simple thing. Align truth with language. Okay, your word and your mind, your tongue if you're speaking, your keyboard or pen has to be aligned. That's a simple thing, which is even more evocatively discussed in Mahabharata. This is one of my favorite stories and debates. This comes in the Shanti Parva. It's a debate between Sulabha and Janaka. Janaka puts down Sulabha as a woman and says that she's not qualified for emancipation. That's another lovely story, another day. But when she responds, she tells Janaka why she is going to be effective and convincing. And she says that my words will be full of meaning, it will be consistent, it will be to the point, it will be smooth, it will have no doubt, it will not be unkind, it won't be all that you want to attribute towards good writing can be found in this beautiful debate in the story. When George Orwell is asked, why do you write? This is the next point. Another impediment in writing. Orwell said, sheer egoism, aesthetic enthusiasm, historical impulse. I feel like writing that moment, for that moment. Or they have a political purpose. All valid and absolutely candid. And all of us do this. If not any one, maybe all the four, I don't know, depends. And probably the answer also depends for when and how I'm writing. There are also other kinds of writing. Serious writings, which Lange divides it into formal writing, people who only focus on the formal aspects, people who focus only on the emotional aspect, people who focus more in the historic, and some who write activist. And I personally find, and history also tells us, all forms of writing are important. It doesn't mean only an activist critical writing is important. Everything is important, all the four forms of writing, and they all serve their purpose. But having just the formal alone will not be sufficient. A combination of this, and it's not that all the writers can do all the things, but a magazine, a professional magazine, ensures that there is a diversity of such writings. It's made, so the positioning of the journal becomes important, and I find there is space for all the four writings, either in a journal or in different journals. But the most challenging form of writing, in my view, is not writing for the peers. It is for public writing. How do we engage with non-architects? How do we write in simpler terms? Because architecture often easily gets merged in lifestyle sections of papers. But what we want to do is bring it into public discourse without bringing into public discourse. So, and how do we do that is a challenge, because a newspaper is a competitive space. All kinds of news wants to find a space. So unless you demonstrate, I'm talking from my personal experience, that if you cannot demonstrate that this particular topic is of reader's importance, you'll never get that 6 inch space or 2 column space or whatever that you're given. Okay. So, and how do we do quality writing? How do we engage with this? Does every opinion count to a meaningful writing? Daniel Mendelsohn offers a very simple formula, and which I often share it with my students. Opinion is important, that is your taste, but combined with knowledge is what gives you a meaningful judgment. Just every opinion, a thumbs up, a thumbs down, like a heart and a not, heart struck, that's not an engagement. An engagement comes, and second, it also has a critical art. The qualities of writing become significant here. But equally important, I think, is to write with pleasure. What is the point just writing some rough stuff, however knowledgeable that be? The sheer pleasure of writing, because every form has a certain aesthetical intention behind it. Okay. But there is something that is beyond our control. You can write, you can improve your writing, you can tick all the check boxes, but if a society by large is not discerning, if it is itself not evaluating, then any amount of writing cannot help. But that doesn't have to put us more cynical. We'll have to continuously make effort. As Sorkin said, it's a tireless work. It's an incessant work that one engages. My last 2 slides, and this is meant for the young readers, young writers here, or anyone who's aspiring. Every writer is an avid reader. Okay, and that is tied to Mendelssohn's words. Knowledge and taste is what gives it, and writing is a practice. In fact, some evolutionary biologists say, which I don't agree, but say that writing is is not natural to human beings. It is, while speaking is natural, writing is something that you inculcate. Okay, and writing is a practice. And I would like to conclude this short presentation with another favorite poem from Lala, a 14th century Kashmiri poet, wonderfully translated by Ranjit Oskote. People always ask me, should I take a course? Should I enroll in architectural criticism? Yes, all that matters. But as Lala said, what books taught me, I've practiced. Okay, I've learned and I've practiced. But there are also things that the books didn't teach me. I've taught it myself. Okay, and I haven't stopped with this learning. I've gone into the forest and I rest with the lion, which means she has put to practice. She has faced challenges. And she says, I didn't get this far by doing contradictory things. And this is, in a sense, what it's all about. Commitment, capacity building, building our knowledge, aligning language and truth, purposefully writing, and at the soul of art is to keep the reader in mind, even though the writing and opinions are all yours. Thank you. And as I said, this is sort of laying out the landscape, and I would be very happy to take any questions. I know I've been a bit ambitious to cover a wide range of issues, and as I said, I was trying to be a landscape painter here. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Srivathsan sir. This was a wonderful talk. And like Alexander Lange had told, please get to the point. And we had given you only half an hour, and it was to the point, dot. So highly appreciate it. And we have received some questions. I have my own question, which I would like to ask, and then I'll read out the questions from the people. One question is, I have heard from different speakers in different talks that good architectural critics bring good architecture. How true or how much you believe that is true?
No, good architecture is brought by good architects. good critics enable that through conversations and discourses. And a good critic, in one sense, is a partner to the production of good buildings, but necessarily not the sole, the sole motivator of it. Certainly can't be. Certainly not in practice.
Thank you. We have two questions here. One by architect Tarangini. She says, "Good evening, sir. I'm a huge fan of Jane Jacobs' Life and Death of Great American Cities. Can you suggest any similar book?"
I think I'll give you my email ID. Will correspond. I can give you a wonderful list of reading. Also depends what specifically you're interested. But there's so much to read. But I'll be very happy to share something for you to read based on your interest. But I'll take it later offline.
Thank you, sir. And there is one more question by, there is no name for that, but there is a question. Where should one start with the interest of writing to be an architectural journalist? That's the question.
As someone said, there's no safe place to begin. Begin. That's what it matters. But equip oneself to do it. And equipping oneself is only not just by reading, but also by practice. So writing is also practice. So one has to write. And certainly it's as much a hard work as anything else. So write and write more. And please find a good mentor. That's absolutely important. Because there's only up to a point that you could self-improve. And finding a good mentor who's not necessarily knowledgeable entirely in architecture, but knowledgeable as an editor, writer. If you can get someone in one person both, knowledgeable in architecture and a good writer, wonderful. But otherwise, you can find more mentors. But mentorship is absolutely necessary.
Okay, there is one more question by Meena Murugappan. She is appreciating a brilliant speech. Srivathsan sir, at our firm, we truly believe in the power of words to communicate our design and works. But how do we make architecture writing as part of practice studio culture? How do we percolate it throughout the entire team, including younger architects, especially when deadlines are always around the corner?
Everything is an effort. Nothing comes by itself, I'm sure. See, if you really are keen and if you realize the importance, and you find increasingly writing, there is a small section in each firm which focuses on writing. Some have actually outsourced it. So they have a formal tie-up with financial terms, TOR, and I know of such firms which help architects write about their project. I have I have a good friend of mine from abroad whose job is to teach how to write briefs for architecture program. So, and we have used his services to train teachers of how to write studio briefs. So there are some people who offer such training, and one you should put, you have to allocate time, if not resource. Good if it is both, but it has to come by an effort. So there is no, if you say, I don't have the time, you will never be able to get to that. Either you find time or you find time outside your thing and you pay for it, or I don't know, in whatever manner you set up a collaboration. But yes, you need to, it's an effort and you need to find time for that.
There are some more questions, interesting questions. How can architectural writing be evolved to capture the attention of this meme generation? As people shy to write in English, should writing in regional languages be encouraged more? I think this is by Krishna Sudha, architect Krishna Sudha.
Absolutely. If you're talking about expanding the constituency of readership, English alone is insufficient. We need to write, and I have to say, one of my pride collection in my bookshelf is Frank Lloyd Wright in Suyasarida. Okay, this was written many years ago by someone, and there are some publications in Tamil, at least I'm familiar with. I don't know about other languages. I don't know those languages, but I have seen some important publications coming in Tamil, and part of the center that I am part of, one of our agendas is to do bilingual publications, and we are just trying to look for funds to support. And we have identified 10 key texts, which we think an undergrad student should learn. And we are trying to do bilingual in Hindi, Gujarati, and Tamil if we get the funds. So language is very critical, and we need to find bilingual writers or even people who write in other regional languages. How to draw attention? Actually, if all of us really look up our smart app and see the health of your usage, I'm sure everyone is clocking more than 7 hours or 8 hours of smartphone usage, and you would find probably are spending 2-3 hours on WhatsApp and whatever. So all of us are part of this. So the question is, yes, it is a challenge. Short attention span has been a challenge, not only here, but even in teaching. So, but the question is, how do you engage? Yes, it is a problem, but we cannot give up hope, and we cannot but find solutions. So there are many ways to do this, I suppose. One, as somebody told me in my early years of teaching, said start with something which a student is interested in learning, not in what is you're interested in teaching. So without an interest, so we'll have to find means. And I'm a little practical about it, and I really don't see a very large section taking to writing. It will be a smaller percentage, both in terms of interest and effort and capacity and all that, which is perfectly all right. And different forms of writing. We have plenty of blog. I'm very impressed by some of those who blog. I haven't put their names here. And I'm very impressed by some of the Insta posts. Particularly, there's a young girl who's been covering some buildings between 70 and 80s, 50 buildings. I'm very impressed, both by the visual and the text. So there is an healthy group of people doing, and this one of the slides I put, Agam Say and all that are done by young people. I don't know if they still continue to publish. So there's a lot of very interesting stuff happening. We'll have to see also equally those who are making efforts and recognize them as much as help those who are not, who want to.
Sir, this is from Dr. Priya Sasidaran. How much of subjectivity really comes into architectural critiquing?
As somebody said, criticism is about the critique. No good writer shies away from subjectivism because it's all about my opinion, my opinion. But that mine, as I told you, is not an opinion. It is moderated by my knowledge. Correct? How many of us would want to wait and read a particular writer? I want to read what Pratap Bhanu Mehta has to say about political conditions. I love to read what he has to say, correct? I like to read what Martilal has to say about various philosophical things. It's his view, but it's also a substantiated view. So first, let's acknowledge all opinions are subjective, and there is nothing like subjective, and we are subjects embedded in the larger context. Our views are reflective of what's happening around us. But more importantly, it is not just opinion, but it is a substantiated opinion. So how well you substantiate is important. And your credibility improves or enhances only when you have a substantiation for your opinion, not just for your opinion. It has to be well argued.
Whenever we give an opinion, we need to substantiate it so that it becomes stronger. Okay.
Knowledge and...
Okay, there is one more question which I'd like you to take. Do you think, this is by Jagan P, do you think mainstream newspapers and media give enough attention as it's done in the West? If at all given enough focus, how far do you think it's going to help our quality of built environment?
See, currently the newspapers are in bad shape in terms of the revenue models and financial things. Even in West, let's say New York, many firms, New York Times and so on, have sort of closed their architectural critics. They no more have them on their payroll like they used to have once. So the newspapers by itself are struggling in terms of revenue we're seeing. It's more of revenues are moving into digital side. And digital has an unlimited space, but print is going to be a problem. One. Two, I think newspapers understand cities much better than architecture. When you pitch a story about a city, they immediately understand and grasp the public consequence of that, the reader interest. But it takes a while to convince about an architectural story. But I'm increasingly seeing papers are slowly dedicating spaces for this. But in future, I don't see we'll have a lot of space in print, but certainly digital outlets will have.
Okay, there are some questions related to architectural journalism coming in the mainstream education. Should we have it as a part of architectural course, BR course? Some questions related to what is your take on it? And one of them is asking if you would like to be a part of the curriculum, to include that in the curriculum.
So I myself used to teach a course called Architectural Criticism and Writing. But my experience is that this is just to whet your appetite a bit, but doesn't mean it gives you a great depth. And I always found the regular model of classes are not helpful. A workshop model is a much better mode of trying to deal with this subject, because it's also, you need to find time to write, and you have to continuously write. So if you were to spread over 16 weeks, you would lose some of these intensities. And I prefer a workshop model, but this, you should treat it as a 101, as the American universities call it. It's an introduction to it. So you understand a bit of the basics and get a large sense of it. But later, as a postgraduate pursuit or independent pursuit, you dedicate a lot of time, because currently, given your academic structure with the studio plus 6 subjects, I don't want to burden students a lot more. It doesn't serve much purpose. But as an elective, as a workshop, but certainly as a pursuit, there must be. And I'm sure if the new education policy comes and eventually architecture education becomes 3+2+2 model, which looks like the possible future, the last 2 years can be focused on some of these new emerging areas. Not new, but new interest areas.
Yeah. Sure, sir. Thanks a lot for your wonderful talk and also answering our viewers' questions.